Well, good morning, everyone. So we are in this parallel sessions number 4. This 4 presentations around performance studies. First of all, it's a great honor to present you Joan Grimalt, former teacher, colleague, and friend, who brought me to this inquiring questions and the world of signification, meanings, and of course performance. Title of his presentation is Pragmatics of Musical Signification, Rhetorical versus Organicist Performance. I really like pragmatics, musical signification, and performance words in the title. So I think this presentation, I'm sure it will be very insightful. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you. Indeed. Is there a way to analyze music that is relevant to performance? If a performer seeks for enlightenment in analysis, what does his or her analysis have to attend to? This paper deals with two opposite views on music. Both are present in our current conservatoires, an organicist and the rhetorical stance. The organicist one is still predominant in modern and contemporary departments, and thus in most piano, strings, conducting classes. The rhetorical approach instead is prevailing in ancient music departments. I would like to share some thoughts about how this dichotomy is being integrated to enrich each other's views and how it should be integrated even further. To do that, I will offer a brief history of both theories and some practical examples. The big question that John Rink once asked me some years ago is just what impact on performance has knowing about rhetorical and topical aspects? What precisely does change in practice? The paper is based on some of the ideas I wrote down for a chapter within a forthcoming book. This is a product placement. Musical topics and musical performance, edited by Julian Hellerby for Routledge. In Baroque and 18th century theory, a great emphasis is laid on the discursive aspect of music. To compensate for the lack of a text, which was apparently experienced as a problematic loss, music in general, and particularly the new instrumental genres, had to share a rhetoric quality, had to tell things, were supposed to move the listeners. Accordingly, metaphors relating expressive poetic speech in music are present everywhere in theoretical texts of mid-17th to mid-19th centuries. On the other hand, around the middle of the 19th century, a new doctrine of unitarism begins to appear. It affirms unity and coherence as superior principles. Music as discourse is replaced progressively by the metaphors of organic growth and of architectural construction. Whole movements, sonatas and symphonies are seen to be born out of their own material, just as the oak from an acorn. The Unitarist ideology invokes historical sources, mainly Goethe's studies in natural history, and also some of the ancient Greek philosophers. As an ideology, Unitarism and Organicism are part of the modern idea of equality, but mandatory equality tends to exclude all difference in favor of a greater unity. Also in favor of higher degrees of abstraction. This may sound strange today, especially to the young ones, but it was a common ideology in late Romantic times, and it shaped the political and the academic landscape of most of the 20th century. One early example of unitarism is Adolf Bernhard Marx criticizing Beethoven's Razumovsky quartets for their inclusion of extraneous Russian songs. Prince Razumovsky's commission was to include those songs, but for Marx in 1859, they challenged the work's unity and autonomy. Mid-19th century is also the historical moment where the new idea of form is born. Thus, a rhetorical model that is intrinsically tied to time yields to a spatial, abstract concept. In other words, time becomes space in music theoretical discourse of the second half of the 19th century. The new trend to draw formal diagrams is a sign of a characteristic atemporal statism that will cast a long shadow on music's understanding of the 20th century. One of the myths of organicism is the possibility of experiencing form as a whole. In the strongly ideologized post-romantic conceptions, the performer and the ideal listener should be able to grasp the entire musical work from A to Z as one only breath. This was denounced as neo-idealistic notion with Germanic roots by Nicholas Cook already in 1990. In fact, the idea of wholeness and of overarching form stands in contradiction to the way most people listen to music, watch a theater performance, or a movie. And it can easily degenerate in a uniform, monotonous tone in performance, more attentive to coherence and unity than to contrasts and surprises. In musicians' jargon, this translates as an instruction to seek for more direction, and it's usually accompanied by this gesture. More direction. The acme of unitarism was reached in the 1950s and 60s. These are also the years where an uncompromising avant-garde produces music that seeks to leave behind the whole rhetorical tradition. At the same time, musical signification was excluded from the theoretical discourse in mid-20th century conservatoires and universities. Can you read this? Yes, you can. In the 1980s, however, a new trend is discernible. As a reaction to the zealous formalism that dominated both musical performance and theoretical discourse, some pioneers started to rebuild bridges to the seemingly forgotten tradition of music as message. This reconstructing of the musical landscape of the past has two main complementary sides: historically informed performance and musical hermeneutics. Historically informed performance focused on a reconstruction of old instruments and of bygone instrumental practices. This new approach can be qualified as a game changer. It affected all aspects of musical practice, and not only in the so-called ancient music departments. Now, around the same time when historically informed performance began, an impressive hermeneutic exercise found its start both in the US and in Europe. Leonard Ratner's classic music, of which we are celebrating the 42nd anniversary with the round table later today, contributed the term musical topic or topos that has grown to a whole topic theory. In Europe, the research on music semantics by Konstantin Floros and a few other mavericks that brave enough to defy the formalist dogma from within have empowered lots of new research. We had yesterday a round table to review the fantastic achievements of Professor Floros. One of his most illuminating books bears the title Music as Message. Also in the 1980s, a group of musicologists started to meet in Paris. This was the seed of our international congresses on musical signification, led by Eero Tarasti, of which we are celebrating the 15th edition. Parallel to his own impressive production in music semiotics, in these 15 meetings so far, Professor Tarasti has gathered musicologists from the whole world around the idea of musical signification, a concept that includes many different points of view: semiotics, rhetoric, performance, philosophy, literature, topic theory, neurology. One of the results of the emergence of a historically informed performance and the musical hermeneutic is that performance has come to be part of current musicology. It is usually called performance studies, and it is well represented in this congress. It has also the advantage that it includes popular music. Now, enough history and theory. Let's move to praxis and examples. In performance practice, the main parameter where organicist and rhetorical stances manifest their differences is arguably pulse. Solo piano music was a preferred place for composers of the 18th century to represent a new subjectivity. This new subject finds a musical expression in a spontaneous discursive style, full of represented hesitations, varied repetitions, pauses, and contrasts. So it is no surprise that harpsichord and fortepiano players tend to perform their repertoire from the 17th and 18th centuries in a flexible meter. Beethoven's piano sonata in F minor, opus 2, number 1, starts with a markedly rhetorical gesture. Traditional Formenlehre calls this the main subject. Rhetorically, it sounds like an improvised contraposition. In one hand, there is a martial reference, a call upwards, albeit dysphoric in minor. On the other hand, this call reference culminates in a neatly vocal gesture, once on the tonic, once on the dominant. The accompaniment, on the other hand, reminds of the bourgeois contemporary contradance. Now, a reference to the contradance stands in contradiction with a martial reference that might have sounded in early Beethoven's ears as old-fashioned and aristocratic as in Mozart's musical world. Finally, the process of motivic dissolution of the vocal motive leads to an accompagnato, recitative reference that sets tragic opera as an expressive frame in a situation where a character describes her state of spirit. In these two last measures of recitative reference, the whole melodic Anstieg, or ascent from F up to C, is reverted to flow down into a pianto, a weeping figure on a half cadence. The ensuing fermata seems to grant some time to the musical persona to think over her next move. After this brief analysis, let us now compare two versions of the beginning as they can be easily found on YouTube. This is Ivo Silama on his fortepiano. All musical topoi and rhetorical awareness shine through this performance. This is now Daniel Barenboim's version on a modern instrument. Above all tempo and pulse change, Barenboim seems to take the whole measure as a metrical unit instead of the half note that is notated. Until the very fermata, he also tries to keep the tempo steady. Moreover, a certain uniformity tends to make all notes equal in sound, which contributes to blur most topical references. As I said before, in 18th century repertoire, a flexible pulse is a sign of subjectivity. The only limits are the awareness of dance and march topoi, which require a steady pulse if we want to represent the reference as here and now. If references to dance, march, or gallop are played in an unsteady meter instead, then a memory or a dream might be represented. This is the specialty of Romantic poetry and music. The exploration of the inner world in Romantic art has been called Seelenlehre, literally a doctrine of the soul. In music, it can be found in a deepening of the spontaneous style that was just described as a mark of the modern subject in 18th century music. From mid-19th century to mid-20th century, a fluctuating pulse can be interpreted as a sign of inwardness, as if the story was being told in indirect speech or in an inner monologue. The best examples can be found in piano solo pieces by Chopin, Schumann, or Brahms, where musical thoughts often appear to be generated, interrupted, or nuanced in real time in front of our ears. A beautiful example of that is the start of Chopin's fourth ballad, Opus 52, where the musical persona seems to recall a line of a poem, endecasyllable, starting from its first 3 syllables that come to mind without any harmony. Once the whole line is remembered, it is pleasurably repeated to finally restate its last 4 syllables in reassurance. This is the way you would count an endecasyllable in Italian. Next, a useful rule of thumb when it comes to interpreting tempo indications is to use the tempo giusto theory. Simplified, it can be reduced to the idea that meter determines the basic tempo. The theory was enunciated by Johann Kirnberger in 1776. And complemented by Kirnberger's disciple, Johann Abraham Peter Schulz. It can be applied on most music from the 18th century up to the second half of the 19th. Relying too much on character indications such as presto or largo can lead to disregarding not only the prescribed meter, but also the underlying topoi in a piece. In slow movements, some performers will act against the tempo giusto by subdividing. In fast pieces, on the contrary, as we saw in Barenboim's version, whole measures are often taken as the metric unit. Following the prescribed meter instead would be a valuable clue to grasp both the beating reference and vocal, oral related gestures above. In the written version of this paper, I have several other examples, but here I will just focus on one of them, where it seems very advisable and very clever to focus, to take seriously the metric initial indication. That is the start of Brahms' first symphony. The subdivided version that many of us are more accustomed to in our young years sounds monumental and distant, with the timpani quavers foregrounded. Performers who observe the 6/8 un poco sostenuto instead display a more nuanced kind of pastoral drama, full of light and rhetorical expression. The main topical reference seems to be a tragic variant of the pastorale or the Siciliana. The syncopations on violins, for instance, as well as a legato that is less tenuto and more flexible to dynamic nuances, give the impression of somebody uttering spontaneously a chromatic passus bruscus upwards, without having previously planned where it would stop. The next motive in bar 9 on woodwinds appears to be a short instrumental interlude in pathetic style. It is reminiscent of the old ominous unison topos from opera seria. Moreover, it introduces a series of pianti on strings that seem to be related to the previous 8 measures as a private reaction to them. Here, feeling the measure in 2 beats allows the rhetorical anticipations to be sent first on woodwinds, then on strings.
This is the version, the normal version with these syncopations. If we simplify this and take the syncopations away, then it would be something like. Of course, if we subdivide, these whole syncopations get completely lost. And also this rhetorical feeling of anticipation. This is the simplified version. This can be felt easily if it's performed in a legato but non tenuto tone, in a flexible way of using the voice. Conclusions. Most topical and rhetorical references are grasped intuitively by performers. However, an awareness on vocal references, on movement, on rhetoric and narrative aspects does have an impact on how a performer delivers her or his interpretation. To the dogmatic, excluding ways of 70 years ago, the answer should be integrative. Nowadays, it is common to use Schenker graphs to prove a hermeneutic point, whereas some decades ago, quoting Schenker implicitly meant to accept some or all of his ideological stances. An analysis that includes musical signification needs a formal harmonic scrutiny as much as the other way around. These are no more incompatible procedures, quite on the contrary. A long tradition reaching back to the early modernity of the madrigal in the 16th century was interrupted in mid-20th century. Soon, however, in the 1980s, a reconnection has grown ever stronger in form of historically informed performance and also in form of a musical hermeneutic or musical semantics in Flores' terms. These efforts result in performance that understand themselves as communicative acts, embracing all aspects of human culture and thus linking music to literature, art and philosophy, but also to religion and politics, to economy and sexuality. This reconnection locates music back to one of its best features, the ability to connect people and their activities, thoughts and feelings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joan. I think it was a really interesting speech. I think we have time for a couple of questions. However, we will also be able to share multiple questions at the end of the 4 presentations. But I think we have time for any questions you may have.
Just one something, which is not a question really, but as a piano student here in the school, I found I think a surprising resistance to all of these things you just explained, this rhetorical approach to music. I mean, I sometimes needed to know these things, to know these singing styles, to know these references, to have a richer approach to performance. But I couldn't talk about this in my piano lessons because that was like, why are you talking about this? Which is not linked with what we are doing here, which was obviously not true, but I found this big resistance, and sometimes I needed just to adjust my performance to what was expected and not to include all these things. But I think just were from reading this comment. I think that I don't know, it's my personal experience here, but I think that at least piano department, there is a kind of resistance to this country. And I think it's kind of
I didn't know that.
it's very sad because they, I think they're doing I've seen this as a kind of invasion, and a kind of, if you take this into account, you will not take into account how the piano has to be played in a good way or just studied. And I think it will be
Yes.
I don't want to create a controversy. Something that worries me a bit.
There is no even a controversy, but there should be one. I think. I wish, I've been trying to create controversy all these years. Discuss these matters openly, because I think it's the way that things can be cleared and can be brought forward. But if there's no possibility of a dialogue, where I can say I disagree with you, if there is not a space for a dialogue, and I've been trying to create that space with some colleagues and friends here, then it's very difficult to move forward. But it reminds me of my youth as a student, where I had to live also a double life.
Yeah, that's exactly my feeling.
I had to prepare a version for my teacher that I knew would please her, and then on my side,
That's exactly what I felt.
I know, and the laughter here shows that we're not alone. This is, alas, no personal thing between the two of us. Yeah.
This question may seem a little bit out of place because it's nothing to do with musical performance events, like how it's embedded in broader cultural phenomena. I wonder whether this emphasis, the shift of emphasis that you mentioned that in the mid-19th century and after the mid-19th century, the emphasis got onto structure and an organic development and things like that. Could it have something to do with the Industrial Revolution and all these, Western obsession with the idea of progress, which has also been used as a justification of colonization? So could this ideology in musical performance can have a relation to broader ideologies in Western societies, in your opinion?
I think there is a link with mechanicism, with a certain distrust of human qualities that had brought us to some notorious disasters in history. So this is what I sense, but I'm sure there are many connections. And yes, I've been studying for many years now why some very good colleagues of ours, very clever people, would still stick to these formalist dogmas that were current 50 years ago when we were studying. Because I think it's an important question to try and understand why somebody would do something so irrational. They're not fools, so they must have. And I've had some results. I even wrote a paper on that for ICMS
13 in London and Canterbury. But yes, it's a big question, and as you say, it is embedded in cultural history of Western mentality.
Yes, I have one question. Thank you very much for this huge panorama and contributions for performance. What do you think about these changes of our mind in performance, taking into account so-called turning points and transgressions in humanity? For example, performative turning points of 60s, of 70s, of effective turning points of the late 90s, because these turning points directed our thinking in culture, for example, from the culture as a text to the culture as an action. And now we need also new kinds of expression. So this is, I think, huge interest in rhetoric. Chopin was also educated by Elsner in rhetorics. So this is the huge role also of education of our consciousness. What do you think about these changes, taking into account this very crucial turning points in humanity? So what do you think about that?
I said that already relating to Floros yesterday. I think that the key, you mentioned that, is the logos, is the word. You know, the study of Latin, Greek, grammar, syntax, rhetoric was the very center of any education until very, very recently. And this has fallen apart around during the 20th century. Now, for me, music is above all a communicative art, so it makes sense to look for analogies with speech, and it is very productive analogy, and it has always been productive. So, and I'm not alone in this, of course, but there is also this other party who prefers to rely on mathematical aspects, mechanical aspects, figures, and so on. And I think we should take that into account as well and integrate instead of looking for a confrontation, which doesn't mean we shouldn't dialogue. On the contrary, we should do that, but not to fight, but to listen to each other. This is what we're doing here.
Yes, Joan, you said, just I want to point out that said analysis relevant or linked to a performance. It's a question. My question is, can analysis be by itself, if not relevant, or if not linked to performance? And can performance be as itself, if not linked to analysis? You talked also about intuitive knowledge, but also awareness. I think that intuitive knowledge, and by the way, let me say that you're not alone. You're not alone, and I know that you are not alone. By many of the ones that we are in this room. I think that intuitive knowledge is necessary, but it's not enough. So we need this awareness. I think that the key is whether we focus on the questions or on the answers. I think that we have to go on with that intuitive knowledge as performance, but we have to question ourselves about that initial intuition and to make the correct questions in order to find possible correct answers. But first of all, I think that that's what's really the key, the point is to make ourselves the correct questions.
Yes, yes, absolutely. This is no question, Gerard, as you know. This is a very good statement. But going back to your first one question. Yes, of course, there can be an analysis that is purely theoretical, that is completely apart from performance, of course. And it may be even an interesting, fruitful one. Why not? It's not what interests me, but it can exist and it exists, and it will always exist. Why not? And also, there can be a performance that is not aware of anything at all and refuses to think. That is also possible, and will always be like that. Why not? But we're interested in other things, in the convergence of these two fields, where reflection and practice meet and enrich each other.
Just one really quick point. I come from a language environment in which performance is not used, which creates a huge trouble. The word just doesn't exist. And what we call performance is music interpretation. And I think that is rather interesting in the context of this discussion, because performance is an interpretation of the musical text, or whatever the text is, a dirty word in this conference. Yeah, I just think that both are cognitive acts. You somehow make sense of the music as an analyst and as a performer. And you may meet somewhere without knowing that you are talking about the same thing necessarily, but it's a cognitive act in any way. That was my point. Sorry, not a question again.
By the way, here we have the same problem in Catalan and in Spanish with the word interpreting. It means both performing and hermeneutic interpreting.
Hello, thanks for watching. My name is Olga Sanchez, and I'm going to discuss musical topics as products and tools of historically informed performance. To begin, a brief terminological clarification. By topics, I refer to the concept coined by Leonard Ratner: musical styles with conventional expressive associations understood by communities of composers, performers, and listeners. What I mean by products is that historical informants can facilitate the recognition of a characteristic style. For example, period wind instruments, with their technological limitations, provide a suitable means to replicate the sound worlds evoked by musical topics such as the Hans or the Pastoral. Conversely, performers might identify a stylistic allusion on the score and use this awareness to inform their performing choices. For example, Stephen Easterlis describes the beginning of Beethoven's Sonata, Opus 5, No. 2, as transporting us into the opera house. Although Easterlis does not engage topics explicitly, his observations contain the main elements of this theoretical framework: stylistic crossovers between different contexts and spaces, instruments impersonating other instruments, and distinct styles recognizable for the audiences of a certain time and place. Ideally, topic theory, as a historicist enterprise, should have something to offer and something to gain from historically informed performance. For the rest of this presentation, I provide some theoretical considerations and summary of relevant literature, mostly drawing on the section Performing Topics from the Oxford Handbook of Topic Theory. Then, I present two case studies by Mozart and Haydn. In both case studies, the presence of a musical topic is not obvious, and its emergence relies heavily on performance. Also, in both examples, the identification of each topic has significant hermeneutic consequences. Playing and hearing these topics as such facilitates expressive interpretations that would not be available otherwise. In the introduction to the handbook, Danuta Mirka compares the insights of topic theory with the discovery of the original colors of the Parthenon, using the metaphor to explain how topical knowledge influences modern reception of 18th century music. Obviously, this archaeological spirit is also present in the discourse of historically informed performance. To be clear, I do not intend to make claims about authenticity, nor judge the value of different analytical traditions and performance practices. What I do suggest is that topic theory and historically informed performance share not only a general interest in excavating the sounds of the past, but also quite specific aesthetic ideals, under which smoothness and purity are gladly traded for contrasts and variety. These shared attitudes promise potential for synergies between period performance and topical analysis. As John Irving puts it, period instruments present technological advantages to convey the sonic properties of certain topics. He also finds that topics offer a valuable potential for action to performance. With a more skeptical view, Sheila Geimer presents topical analysis as a score-driven enterprise. She also observes that performers are not exactly willing to embrace topic theory, especially as a labeling activity. I acknowledge these limitations, but will present with my case studies situations that allow for productive interactions between performance and analysis. First, a violin sonata by Mozart. The second and also final movement of K304 is a minuet with a contrasting trio in E major. Stephen Ranf describes the passage as an instance of the hymn topic, evocative of a spiritual retreat. I find this interpretation compelling, but although I can see elements of the hymn topic on the score, I have some difficulty hearing it. To my ears, the trio sounds more pleasant than spiritual. The danceable quality of the music imparts a lightness that does not quite align with the solemnity required of a hymn. Tempo is a factor that influences my perception. David Brightman plays the fastest trio of the 10 recordings that I have examined, 5 on modern instruments and 5 on period instruments. Within each group, we find a wide range of tempos for the beginning of the trio. To convey the dignity of the hymn topic, relative tempo also matters. Does the trio slow down or does it accelerate in relation to the preceding minuet? Here, we do see one difference between performers playing modern and period instruments. Only in the first group do we find performances with a significant increase in tempo, with the most notable slowdowns being performed on period instruments. In terms of tempo, Bodger and Cooper, Mutter and Orkis, and Han and Zhu seem more likely to convey the expressive properties of the hymn topic by playing the trio rather slow and slower than the minuet. Obviously, tempo is not the only or even the main feature to convey a certain character or topic. Articulation is also key. Here we see some historical correspondences between articulation and character. Hymns belong in the realm of the exalted and solemn. Trios, on the other hand, tend to fall in the pleasant and gentle. At the onset of the trio, Mozart's notation is rather vague. The series of undifferentiated quarter notes, which resembles chorale writing, invites a somewhat heavy execution. What I find is that Mozart's compositional choices hint at the hymn topic not only through texture and articulation, but also through a potential shift in perceived meter. The basic idea of the trio theme gives few metric cues, except for the suspension and chord change on the second downbeat. Nothing distinguishes the first 4 quarter notes, making different metrical hearings possible. An adaptive listener could interpret a meter change in response to the musical input. This interpretation in cut time satisfies 2 of Lertle and Jackendorf's rules of metric preference, the preference for an early downbeat and the preference for binary regularity at all levels. Because this interpretation is less than obvious, especially considering that one has already entrained into triple meter and expects the trio to continue in the same fashion, I provide some additional support to the idea that the score not only allows, but it also invites hearing this metrical shift. First, to harmonize the pickup of a minuet or trio theme with a tonic chord in root position is extremely unusual. Actually, this is the only instance in Mozart's work. Second, when the violin takes over the theme, the onset of the Alberti bass sends a signal inconsistent with the notated meter. When themes begin with a pickup and are accompanied by an Alberti bass, the accompaniment begins either on the following downbeat or the previous downbeat, but not together with the anacrusis. Considering both Mozart's compositional practice and the hearing habits of his contemporaries, to hear these notated upbeats as actual downbeats seems a reasonable interpretation. I should say, however, that the majority of recordings do not agree with me. Despite the metrical ambiguity of the musical surface, most performers play unequivocally in 3/4, under this lilting rendition by Zoom. Despite the rather slow tempo, the ebb and flow of the phrasing highlight danceable qualities rather than spiritual overtones. Occasionally, however, the alternative version materializes. For example, when Mutter downplays the downbeat. Or when the Vos slightly accentuates the third quarter note, which would be the weakest one, in a measure of triple meter. This metric interpretation can only live briefly, as triple meter soon becomes unquestionable. Yet, hearing the onset of the trio alla breve is consistent with compositional practice, and to my ears it has a startling effect, well worth pursuing. The beat unit, shifting from the quarter to the half note, a radical deceleration of tempo, brings the minuet to a halt and helps communicate the spiritual turn suggested by Ram. This fleeting metrical illusion, which can only occur with the aid of performance, contributes to project the hymnic qualities of the music. Now on to the aria by Haydn. Haydn's Armida, based upon Torquato Tasso's poem Gerusalemme Liberata, was performed over 50 times of Esterházy and also heard in Vienna, Budapest, Bratislava, and Turin. Armida is a Saracen sorceress who casts a spell on the crusader Rinaldo and persuades him to fight against Christian soldiers. Unlike other settings of the story, which present Armida trying to kill Rinaldo before falling in love with him, Haydn's opera begins with an already enamored couple. During the first act, neither text nor music reveal Armida's true intentions. What we hear from her is a tender aria and a love duet. Only halfway through the second act, when Rinaldo abandons her, Armida explodes in the rage aria Odio furor dispetto and threatens to punish Rinaldo using her supernatural powers. Within a system of beliefs that associates reason with maleness, as discussed by Lloyd and others, irrational, disorderly passions are often gendered feminine. In the aria, the precipitous tempo, faltering exclamations interrupted by rests, and odd bar phrasing accompany the moment of female emotional outbursts. Dispetto, dolor, remorso, remorso estremo. Vengo per tutto l'estremo. Attaccati a sparcermi il petto. Attaccati a sparcermi il petto. Additionally, Haydn uses elements of the alla turca topic. We find ornaments, rhythmic figuration, and the umpa accompaniment typical of alla turca music, as found in Turkish scenes by Mozart and Gluck, for example. Haydn also writes conspicuous parallel octaves between melody and bass. One potential use of this technique in the musical culture of 18th century Europe is as a sign of stereotype primitiveness. I should say that these alla turca signifiers are less clear to my ears than to my eyes, which brings me back to performance. Here's Jesse Norman as Armida, with Untitled Chapter conducting the Lausanne Chamber Orchestra. And now Cecilia Bartoli with Harnoncourt and the Concentus Musicus V. Norman's Armida sounds more powerful, Bartoli's more desperate, but I wouldn't describe one sounding more or less alla turca than the other. The topic lives in the orchestra as a commentary that adds a layer of meaning to the emotional content of the aria. The Concentus Musicus, with their sharp edge and abrasive sound, have the technological advantage to realize the Janissary resonances of the passage. But Harnoncourt's frantic accelerando makes it harder to play and hear the ornamental details that signify the topic. Their racing speed also cancels the march-like quality that the passage would have in a less rushed tempo. This performance choice suits well Armida's instability and impatience, but does not facilitate the projection of the topic. I find that in both recordings, singers overpower the orchestra, distracting attention from the striking change of texture and figuration of the accompaniment. Though there is much to like about these performances, I regret their apparent lack of commitment to reveal the alla turca elements in the aria. These conventional signs of Oriental otherness are consistent with Armida's ethnicity. At the same time, pairing this topic with a female character is quite unusual. As Mary Hunter observes, the alla turca style was gender masculine, and Oriental women are rarely depicted as musically exotic. In a similar fashion, Armida is typically portrayed in the visual arts with European traits, as we see on the left. On the right, Checo Bravo, who focuses in a much less popular episode of the story, paints Armida with dark hair, an image that does better justice to her geographical origins. This dichotomy manifests itself musically in Haydn's opera. When Armida appears as Rinaldo's beloved, nothing in her music reveals her ethnicity. But when she unleashes her passions, she sounds slightly Moorish. Haydn writes alla turca elements only at the moment when Armida loses her temper, and after Rinaldo discovers that she is a sorceress. In Odio furor dispetto, we hear Armida's musical identity as both woman and exotic other. The Turkish element in the music adds depth to the character. Haydn's use of the topic provides a musical commentary on her intersectionality, a subtle detail easily lost in performance. To perform and to hear these colonialist symbols of exoticism today provides an opportunity to engage with historical and current ideas about gender and race, problematic as they might be. It would be too naive to conclude that topical analysis and period performance need to engage one another to fulfill their historicist purpose. Performers on period or modern instruments alike may find explicit engagement with topic theory neither necessary nor desirable. But to base performing choices on topical knowledge, explicit or tacit, is an act of historical informedness. This knowledge may be especially valuable when trying to find a new angle to approach pieces that have been played and recorded a myriad times. For analysts, the score often provides enough support to justify the presence of a topic, but in certain cases, performance can either erase a topic or make it come to life. As I discussed in my analytical vignettes, we occasionally encounter musical moments that justify pursuing exchanges between topical analysis and period performance. I acknowledge that I have invested significant time and effort to discuss very specific details that fly by in a few seconds. But I find good reasons to justify the effort. When I hear the sacred hymn in the violin sonata and the Turkish elements in Armida's aria, those brief moments have great impact in my perception of the music. I wish to hear those topics because they enrich my aesthetic experience and satisfy my historicist inclination, although I recognize that this need not be the case for other listeners. Future directions to explore productive interactions between these fields could include ethnography for analysts to better understand performers' choices, empirical studies to learn how performance might influence identifications of topics for different listeners and what is at stake with such identification, and broader cross-disciplinary collaborations between analysis and performance, as recently modeled for 20th century music by Daphne Leon. If you or someone you know are interested in any of these paths of inquiry, please contact me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, finally, sorry for the inconvenience. Good morning to everyone. First of all, as a piano performance student, this paper was motivated by a need to delve deeper into the ballads Opus 10 by Johannes Brahms, a work that I wanted to perform in public and that was composed almost 170 years ago. So as a musician, I have felt a little uncomfortable with two extreme positions. That is the dichotomy between music means nothing and music can mean anything. So in the end, hermeneutic analysis has meant a kind of middle ground that dialogues between a contemporary and subjective vision of the work and its corresponding historical context. Also, I wanted to show how the analysis of meanings, far from limiting creativity or imposing specific meanings on music, is a source of broad expressive meanings, of symbols that allow infinite nuances and interpretations. To do this, I wanted to go a step further. After performing the hermeneutic analysis, I wanted to check to what extent the symbols proposed in my analysis coincided with the interpretations of two different professional pianists in a series of interviews that I will analyze later at the end of the presentation. So, carrying out a hermeneutic analysis of Brahms's work, proposing expressive meanings of each ballad can be seen as contradictory to the image that has often been attributed to him as an abstract musician. However, some important statements by several 21st century researchers show how this misunderstanding is already being left behind. Konstantin Floros, in his historical study on Brahms' Frei aber einsam, disproves the labels that Hanslick attributed to his music. Hanslick spoke of absolute and pure music, and this was the germ of a historical misunderstanding that lasted throughout the 20th century. Based on a historicist foundation, also Raymond Monel categorically states, quote, "Semantic analysis of romantic works is not fanciful. On the contrary, neglect of the semantic dimension is historically unsound," end of quote. Also, regarding Brahms's early works, the topoi invoked by Brahms are arguably less ambiguous than Schumann's. Brahms seems to draw his topical vocabulary from Schubert and Beethoven's music, and this would be one possible reinterpretation of the well-known definition given by 20th century critics to Brahms as the most classical of the Romantics. Also, Richard Taruskin explains that Brahms rejected public programmatic contents, but that does not mean that Brahms's music was abstract in its conception. The important thing to keep in mind, in my opinion, is that Brahms's music provided not one single certifiable message. And that fits also Schiller's conception of romantic art when he wrote in 1794 that the real and expressed content that the poet puts in his work remains always finite, but the possible content that he allows us to contribute is an infinite quality. Okay. Sorry, es que desde el ignoro se podía ver si empezaba las notas del presentador. Sí, después se consulten las notas del presentador. Vale.
Perquè la càmera diu que està de lado.
Okay, so for this presentation, I will highlight the topoi that have been most important for me, and also in each ballad that have played an important role at the interviews that I will discuss later. So in the first ballad, the most important thing was that it has aroused much interest, mainly because of its link to the Scottish ballad Edvard, that was translated by Herder in his famous Stimmen der Völker, a collection used by countless composers as part of the romantic fascination with the past. Janus Dickenshit's bardic style is a set of references and topoi that play an important role in this first ballad. It consists of an evocation of the fabled bard of ancient times that arises also from the romantic fascination for the fictitious poet Ossian and his evocations of a legendary past. So ballad number 1 starts presenting a diatonic melody in a narrow register, closer to a recitative than to a proper song-like melody. Particularly, the interruption in measure 3 deforms what could have been a period, antecedent plus consequent, breaking its regularity. The rhetoric figure called apostrophe, a variant of the exclamatio, could be attributed to both descending intervals of fifth in measure 3. So the discourse stops in a half cadence that gives way to the narration itself. Thus, the first 8 measures signal to a narrative prologue marked as spontaneous, as when an attempt is made to recall a story from the past. Then the Hymnic March, in the central section, it comes with the major mode and the allegro ma non troppo indication. It all shows a change in character. So the primary melody in the bass is transformed with a change in style to a hymnic march. It is as if the bard's story would be unfolding in front of our eyes, as when the drama comes into play. And so on. Then in Ballad 2, the first aspect of this ballad that comes at sight, or at ear, is its syncopated rhythm in the bass. Although syncopation could lead to an energetic music, the piano, espressivo dolce indication, and legato in the bass lay the groundwork for a peaceful, calming interpretation.
especially coming from the heavy first ballad. Performed that way, it catches the ear that the syncopated bass, instead of creating a hectic effect, sets up a continuous lilting 8-note texture. This can be understood as a variant of the pastorale rocking rhythm adapted to a double meter. The distinctive flair of the new Siciliana topos prevails. Okay, and we will go to the fourth ballad because of the time, but what I would like to highlight from this last ballad is the inner voice or inner speech topic. So the melody in the central section is placed on the tenor voice with the express indication of Brahms himself not to emphasize it too much. He said, "Con intimissimo sentimento, ma senza troppo marcare la melodia." Besides trying not to stand out too much, this melody must be played with the most intimate feeling. It sounds in C flat and it is hidden inside the texture. All this reminds of the romantic concept of the inner voice. One way to represent the song that sounds inside of the subject is to hide it within the texture, as Schumann also does in the second movement of his Humoresque. He even adds a third staff containing the inner voice. It is a voice to be thought of or sung internally. So once the hermeneutic analysis has been proposed, the meaning emerges from the combination and contextualization of all the topoi found in the work. I just mentioned a few. What I would like to reflect about is that having identified the topoi, genres, and broadly the semantic fields corresponding to each section, the music expressive meaning has been somehow delimited, but also at the same time, each expressive meaning opens a world of nuances and possible narratives that favor a creative performance. So this symbolic richness of musical signs seems to much recurse, leading for the multiple possibilities of a symbolic hermeneutic interpretation. He identifies in symbols a singular power of invention or creation, namely in the production of meaning and semantic innovation. So the idea of doing an interview is an attempt to see to what extent topical and narrative analysis can provide wide spaces for different creative interpretations. First of all, Xavier Barbeta, currently professor of piano performance at the ESMUC, and lucky me because he has been my teacher for almost 4 years. He studied with Leonid Simsev at the Rimsky-Korsakov Conservatoire in St. Petersburg. And he has won prizes as a solo pianist in competitions in Spain and Austria. He also has recorded solo piano works by Beethoven, Schumann, and also Montpou, a Catalan musician, composer. And then Luis Fernando Pérez, who I'm lucky to call him a friend of mine. He has an extensive catalog of recordings which have received numerous prizes. Together with his concertizing frenetic activity, Luis Fernando keeps an intense dedication to teaching at the Centro Superior Catarina Busca in Madrid and at the Marshall Academy in Barcelona, following the wake of his teacher, Alicia de la Rocha. So the expressive meanings extracted from my hermeneutic analysis are shown in purple, and the expressive meanings proposed by Luis Fernando Pérez are shown in yellow, those of Xavier Barbeta in green. I will try to go through as much as fast as I can. Thanks. So, first of all, I mentioned the bardic style. Let's see the answers of both interviewed performers. I will read textually, just translate it to English by myself. If you want to see the full interview, I have this written in a written version. So, to this bardic style, Luis Fernando said, "It's as if the character were still in a state of shock after what has happened. The story's psychological reality, it seems that the individual is beginning to find it at the end of those 8 bars." Xavier Barbeta said, "It could be about something that is deep inside and difficult to bring it out, like something that is hiding. The melody at the beginning, sings the first notes, reminds me of something that is being explained, a story that is being retold." To the Hymnic March, Luis Fernando said, "Central section is asking for the maximum of everything the instrument can give. It must be a culmination as if it had already reached the gates of heaven. It uses a lot of clarinet and a lot of horn. It is totally symphonic, and it is the grandiosity, the legend of the hero, the absolute exaltation." Xavier Barbeta said, "Section B is more martial, with horns and trumpets, and more directional. On a formal level, it's a big crescendo." Regarding the ballad number 2, I mentioned the new Siciliana topos. Luis Fernando said, "Section A is the state of grace, peace, daydreaming, of well-being. This section enacts an almost pastoral, dreamlike state, an afternoon in the countryside of a wonderful day, with birds, with nature." Xavier Barbeta said, "Section A has a more lyrical and cantabile character. The fact that the accompaniment is syncopated and ascends and descends suggests to me a barcarolle movement." Another topos that I mentioned in my hermeneutic analysis was the laughter, to which Luis Fernando Pérez said, "It is a playful moment, it is a laughter, making a very peculiar scale in terms of the intervallic, almost ironic." And Xavier Barbeta said, "I guess Brahms wanted it to be a kind of divertimento, a more light-hearted thing." Okay, and this is the ballad number 3. We can also see, for example, I mentioned the catastrophe, which I could not explain today, but to my catastrophe topos, Xavier Barbeta talked about demonic descent with tritons, and Luis Fernando Pérez mentioned crashing descent, almost tripping. Also, for example, to the baseless and pastoral topos, Xavier Barbeta talked about pastoral and dreamlike state, and Luis Fernando Pérez also mentioned celestial high register. And to conclude, in ballad number 4, I talked about the inner voice or the inner speech, to which Luis Fernando said, "The melody is written in the middle of the texture, and Brahms asks that the melody be not too marked. This section has not a very blatant feeling or a very exhibited feeling. It has to be very intimate with the melody." Also, Xavier Barbeta said, "Brahms indicates not to mark that voice, as if wanting to hide something. It is the voice of conscience," he said. So, as you can see, the expressive meanings proposed by Luis Fernando Pérez and Xavier Barbeta present many similarities, but without losing their individual originality. Many of the expressive meanings they propose are embraced within the topos proposed by my hermeneutic analysis, but each performer brings nuances and different lights to the work, which is of great richness and creativity. So as a final conclusion, hermeneutic analysis seems to be or seems to have a great place when performing Brahms's music. This type of analysis assumes that there is no single truth in music, no univocal meaning, but that music is connotative and allows for infinite interpretations. What hermeneutic analysis does is to propose broad meanings based on historicism and reliable sources that can orient the listener and the performer of the 21st century and connect him or her with the meanings that could have been present at the time the work was conceived. Once the expressive meanings have been obtained from the hermeneutic analysis, there is still ample room for imagination, as they are open and connotative meanings in the format of semantic fields, tones of the discourse, agency, temporality, or narrative, among others. So hermeneutic analysis has proved to be a useful way to put in common the historical meanings that remain in the work, along with the rest of the intertextual references of our time. Moreover, it offers a consensus as to meanings that in turn allows each performer to develop his or her creativity, sharing a common ground. That is what makes it possible for this work to remain comprehensible and exciting for the public. So many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Christina, for your presentation. Are there any questions for Christina? Any comments? Yes, sure.
So thank you very much. I'm very happy to my friends what the presentation do. And I'd like to ask just to make sure, because I'm not sure myself about the new Siciliana. As far as I saw, it was in double meter. Is it possible to have a Siciliana in double meter? Maybe I'm making up things, but.
Yes, I reflect about that in my written version. It's just the feeling, the corcheas, quarter notes, and by doing a syncopation in double meter, you can hear like three, like the same pulse. So it's the same, it's the scent of the pastoral rhythm, but it's adapted like in a new meter, and it is called the new Siciliana, which is not necessarily a 6-part width.
Sorry, the new Siciliana is a special kind of Siciliana which has been described somewhere, or
Yes, Raymond Monel did that, and it's like an adaptation to the 19th century. So it's not so a representation of the rhythm and the dance, but just the scent, and it's characterized by interruptions. So one moment you hear the Siciliana rhythm, or you feel the Siciliana rhythm, but then it is interrupted by some spontaneous commentaries as the subject. So it's more adapted to the 19th century.
I have one question for you. Just I was guessing. What came first in your case? The analysis, and then you decided to perform. I understood that you performed ballets in your final performance. So what came first? You analyzed first the piece, then you decided to perform them, or you already knew that you want to perform them because of any possible intuition, and then you analyze them later?
So in this case, I wanted to play some Brahms piece, And I chose this piece with help of my professor, but also because it seemed to me that I didn't understand this piece. I love Brahms's music, but ballads always remained very unfamiliar or strange. I didn't know easily what they were expressing. So I found if I wanted to guess or to understand better this piece, I had to play and also to do the analysis. And I always try to do both at the same time.
So now you understand that.
At least I have
You have-
a personal opinion about it.
I think that's a really good point. Okay. And I'm sure that this point was raised in another presentation. I think it was with Lucas' concert, that I'm sure that has helped to gain more security, more self-confidence while performing. That's very important for performance.
Yeah, for me it's basic because I need to know at least what I want to express. It's not just to know the music, because if I just do so, I don't feel sure of myself.
So thanks for your presentation. I just would like to highlight the way you and the other two pianists agree, absolutely agree in the interpretation overall, especially in the first ballet. So I would like to know if the interviews were somehow guided, because it's interesting for me, because sometimes we hear that kind of interpretation are very subjective, and we see how good performers know that kind of feeling is there in the score, and it's there is intersubjectivity.
Yes, important word in this work. So I wanted to hear this question because I also had this question in my exam the other day presenting this work. But no, I can promise. I was tempted because if you see the written version, not everything corresponds. I will be frank, but I think there's some. Is this word intersubjectivity? So these performers, of course, they have read a lot, but they are not music theorists. But they have played all the repertoire of Brahms's music and 19th century music, and they don't know why they know these things, but they know them. And in the interviews, they said, well, I'm not sure I'm saying that, but this is not reliable. And I said, no, it is reliable. I can trust you because you have also credibility by your experience as a performer. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I would like to add to this, because of the question, Mario's question, I think is very important. And what you were saying also, it reminds me of a definition by Gravos Marta some decades ago, actually, a long time ago. He said we could define musical signification by the wisdom that performers have. So most of the time what we do here as an analyst, as a theorist, is to give words to these intuitions that we were talking about. We, as a performer, you know, because as you said, we have this intertextual source of information. You know the whole branch. And you know the musical context, not even the poetic, literary, cultural, philosophy, just the music. It gives you so much information that if you're not a complete fool, you slowly you start to understand. And then, of course, it's another thing to put words to it. And to put words that are historically sound. This is our task. But at least a performer knows. And if you wanted to prove that somewhere, your work, your analysis could be used as a proof of that. how much the performer knows.
Can I react to that? Because I have a similar question, which is what my students ask me often, which is it possible that the composer was really aware of all that you are saying there is in the music? And perhaps you gave us the answer, which comes from, these people being performers and musicians and composers. So they had this sort of competence, perhaps not necessarily coming with this theoretical comprehension behind all of that, but maybe that is the answer which I just wanted to point out that you gave me. And also, I think that you just gave us the answer to the question why the performers are so reluctant to take on these theoretical perspectives, because they derive their competence from the knowledge of the repertoire which they perform. So they feel like they don't need this, but perhaps the students do need this way into it because they have not yet had the chance to play through all of Brahms and all of Schumann and all of Schubert and blah blah blah. So yeah, it is useful for me anyway.
I find it's always very useful this notion of interpretive community by sound like fish. This is my favorite. I don't know how. I think it is helpful, and from the not long, of course, I only started to teach students the analysis instrumentalists, and they very often find it quite convincing because they ask if it is something that's if our goal in the analysis is to find what the composer wrote, or it is about our feelings, or is it about the right answer for the. I don't know, interpretive community helps.
Just to continue that thought for a moment, it's interesting to see the comments that you gained in interview, and that appears in your presentation as interview, as a special kind of information. But it looks like, and you would know this better than I do, it looks like the kind of thing that a teacher would anyway say to their pupil as they're having a discussion about, how do you play the piece. So I wonder if there is some sort of tradition, if you like, actual verbal tradition of explanation, which goes in parallel in very specific ways through teacher to pupil to.
I think so. I'm not sure, but those two pianists, they didn't study with the same teachers, but I think they belong to a similar culture. So Russian, they both had Russian teachers that they try to talk about meanings, and it was like normal for them to talk about that. When I explained to Luis Fernando what I was trying to do, I tried to explain like very complicated, and he said, "Oh, but it's just talking. We're just talking about Brahms' music," and for them was like the most natural thing. So
That's all. Yes, there is. Why is it that in Russia there is uninterrupted tradition of a hermeneutic way of looking into music, which in the rest of Europe seems to be interrupted?
I don't know. I mean, the tradition that goes way, way back. Yes, and it's practically it's uninterrupted until now. But my explanation is that's the way it is.
Yes, I think that Joan made a really good point, but maybe performers know everything what we talked about, but I think that not every performer knows how to talk about it. They don't find the words, and I think that's where our task gets very pragmatic or useful. And I think that's very important. The point that Peter also said. I'm sure that when you interview both pianists, in this case also teachers, they knew that the context of that interview was this work. I mean, my question is, would they talk in those precise terms in a normal piano performance class with every student that they have?
No.
Maybe they use those terms knowing that you know those terms and that was contextualized in this kind of work. I think that our fight is to get to talk about this in any performance classroom.
Have you asked the question?
Yes,
Have you asked the question how your teacher told you about this piece? You were told to do this. I'm thinking about the generational thing from Schumann maybe himself or Brahms in this case.
Yeah, well, I was lucky to be able to choose this piece, but when we had lessons, my Xavier Barbeta, who is the professor that I have had, he always he also had this intellectual side or more literal side, but he is a very pragmatic musician, so he was more practical and always looking for technical issues and how to solve them in a short time. And then when I did the interview with him, I also discovered an intellectual side and a hidden side that he had. So it's maybe the environment of the class, maybe for the time that we have, we don't have all the time, didn't allow us to grasp on all those meanings. But then maybe they came out just by playing. But then when talking in the interview, there he talked very clearly about all of that.
Can I just ask you, because you mentioned that you have been trying to create an environment for dialogue in your institution, and since I'm very sympathetic to what you said about this gap that there seems to be between performers and theorists. How did you try to go about that?
Well, this year we will have for the third consecutive year we will have a meeting in principle similar to a conference, but the focus is on us in the school. So we have people around. They have lunches with people and we'll trying to convince them to take part in these meetings and dialogues. And I try to invite people from very different backgrounds and ideologies to meet and talk about all these issues. As you may expect, in the end, all the people that we meet agree basically, and those with whom there would be a disagreement, a fruitful and interesting one to discuss, which refuse or just won't even answer emails and so on. So in the end, it is interesting, I think, for the students in the first place. But it would be a place, and I think it's good that we created it, that it goes on. One day, if there is the will for dialogue, the space will be there because it was created specifically for this purpose.
And I'm wondering, do you dare try to tell the students how to play their piece based on your insight as a theorist? Because that might be like the ultimate challenge, perhaps, to the piano teacher to actually work with their students. Is that part of your meetings or conferences that you just try to play music and to give instructions from both sides?
No, it is part of another matter that I teach. It is called career analysis, so analysis workshop.
Okay.
And here we often collide with instrument teachers and with singing teachers, those who teach the singers, because sometimes I would say, why are you doing this? This doesn't make it well. My teacher told me. Oh, I'm sorry. Understand what? I'm sorry.
I can confirm what he is saying. I asked him to hear my performance of some of the work, Schubert a month ago, and I was feeling that thing he's a bit more living another life, because I knew that some things that he was something life that he was living was really interesting and my comprehension of the piece. And my teacher would reject. So it was like, okay, now I know how could play this by understanding it more deeply, but then I know what I will have to do with my teacher.
Yes, I think that, and I can certify that. So, I mean, first you have to mix both inputs in your personal practice, and then you realize that the technique, the octave technique that your piano teacher is telling you gets easier to both understand and execute when you know that it's an exclamatio, or same with the trumpets. I mean, first it has to be an inner mixture, like you cook hiding a little bit, but I mean the purpose is, of course, to be able to mix both inputs in real time in performance class, but you have to get much many inputs that you can, and then you have to build your personal digestion out of those many inputs.
So, to be fair, if I'm sure people have had this experience, if you've worked with more than one teacher at a time, they'll both tell you totally different things too. So I would not necessarily think it's like a performer versus like a theorist issue. It's just like two different perspectives that you have to deal with. Like I definitely played with one teacher, then I go to another, and they're like, "Why are you doing that?" And it's like, "Oh well, it's the same experience, all the other ones told me to play it that way." So yeah, I just thought I'd throw that out there. I just think it's anytime you have two competing ideas, you're going to run into that issue, which is all the time.
Okay, so if there are not any more questions, I think we can finish the session. Now I believe we have lunch break, so we'll continue in the afternoon with roundtable. Thank you.